The first time I held it, I thought it had to be a mistake. A clay jar from ancient Egypt, sealed for over 3,000 years, and the grain inside could still sprout. How do you explain that in a world where our food spoils in days when the power goes out? What if the things we call primitive were, in some quiet ways, far ahead of us? What if there are everyday skills, forgotten crafts, and invisible sciences that ancient people not just did well, but better? Imagine walking through a city where buildings stay cool without electricity, where harbor walls shrug off storms for 2,000 years, where a surgeon with stone tools and plant extracts calmly opens a skull and the patient survives. Imagine crossing an ocean without GPS, finding a speck of land in endless water, guided only by stars and the feel of waves against wood. In this journey, you are the explorer, your boots on temple floors, your hands on weathered stone, your questions echoing in tombs, workshops, theaters, and tunnels carved into the earth. You will touch steel we cannot quite remake, hear whispers in amphitheaters built before microphones, and trace knots of string that once held the memory of an empire. If our ancestors could do all of this without our machines, then the real question is not just how they did it. It is what else they knew that we have completely forgotten. The temple at Karnak stretches higher than I expected. Standing beneath its columns, I feel like an insect. Each pillar weighs hundreds of tons, each one perfectly aligned. And here's the strange part: no blueprints, no detailed plans, no CAD models or engineering software. The ancient Egyptians built the largest religious complex in history using only hand tools, rope, and something we've almost entirely lost: spatial intuition. When I trace my fingers along the joints, I can feel the precision. Stones fitted so tightly that not even a blade can slip between them. The tolerances are measured in fractions of millimeters. Modern stonemasons struggle to achieve this even with laser levels and diamond-tipped cutting tools. Yet the Egyptians did it with copper chisels, wooden mallets, and dolerite pounders. The question that haunted me as I walked those halls wasn't how they moved the stones, it was how they knew exactly where each one belonged. Recent archaeological research has revealed something extraordinary. The ancient builders used a system of proportional grids and sacred geometry that existed entirely in their minds and in simple rope measurements. They worked from a conceptual understanding of space that didn't require written plans. Master builders trained apprentices through direct observation and hands-on practice, passing down three-dimensional spatial knowledge that our modern education system has almost completely abandoned. We've outsourced that intuition to computers. The Great Pyramid at Giza demonstrates this even more dramatically. 2.3 million stone blocks, average weight 2.5 tons, some weighing over 80 tons, built with an accuracy that modern engineers still debate. The base is leveled to within 2.1 centimeters across its entire 230-meter length. The sides align to the cardinal directions with an error of less than 1/15 of a degree. No blueprints, no modern surveying equipment, just an understanding of geometry, astronomy, and spatial relationships that we've traded for digital precision. I once watched a documentary where modern engineers tried to replicate Egyptian stone moving techniques. They succeeded barely, using dozens of workers and weeks of effort to move a single block a short distance. But here's what struck me. The ancient builders didn't just move stones, they moved them accurately. They placed them exactly where they needed to be, in three-dimensional space, accounting for weight distribution, structural load, and aesthetic alignment, all without the tools we consider essential. The cognitive skills required for this kind of construction were different from ours. Not inferior. Different. Ancient builders developed a form of embodied knowledge, a physical intuition about space, weight, leverage, and material properties that came from lifelong immersion in craft. They could look at a block of stone and know, through experience burned into their muscles and minds, exactly how it would behave. They could estimate angles and distances with accuracy that would take us instruments to match. What's most humbling is realizing that this wasn't unique to Egypt. The Inca fitted polygonal stones with such precision that we still can't explain their methods. The builders of Angkor Wat created structures of staggering complexity without written architectural plans. The megalithic temples of Malta, older than the pyramids, show the same impossible precision. This wasn't luck. This was systematic knowledge. But if they could build monuments that last millennia without blueprints, what else could they create that we've forgotten? Because while they were shaping stone with impossible accuracy, they were also mixing something that would outlast everything they built. And when you see it still standing after 2,000 years of storms, you start to understand just how much we've lost. The harbor walls at Caesarea Maritima still stand. 2,000 years of waves, earthquakes, storms that shattered modern piers, yet Roman concrete endures. I crouched beside a fragment once, watching seawater lap against stone that shouldn't exist anymore. Our modern concrete crumbles in decades. Theirs grows stronger underwater. The secret: volcanic ash mixed with lime and seawater creates a chemical reaction that actually reinforces itself over centuries. Modern concrete has a problem. It's designed for strength, not longevity. The Portland cement we use today begins degrading almost immediately when exposed to salt water. The steel reinforcement bars inside corrode, expand, and crack the concrete from within. Coastal structures need constant maintenance. Bridges require replacement every 50 to 70 years. Yet Roman maritime concrete, submerged in one of the most corrosive environments on Earth, remains intact after 2 millennia. When researchers finally analyzed samples under electron microscopes, they found something unexpected. The volcanic ash the Romans used, called pozzolana, contained aluminum and silica compounds that react with seawater to form rare minerals. One of them, aluminum tobermorite, grows within the concrete's structure like crystalline reinforcement. It's a mineral so rare in nature that most geologists never encounter it. But in Roman concrete, it forms continuously, actually making the material stronger as it ages. The Romans didn't understand the chemistry. They couldn't see the molecular structures forming in their concrete, but they understood empirically that mixing volcanic ash from specific deposits near Mount Vesuvius with lime and seawater created something extraordinary. They tested, they observed, they refined the mixture over generations until they had a formula that worked. Then they built harbor walls, aqueducts, and the Pantheon's massive dome, which remains the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome after nearly 1,900 years. I stood inside the Pantheon once, looking up at the oculus. Rain fell through the opening, creating a cylinder of light and water. The dome above me weighs 4,500 tons. No steel, no reinforcement, just Roman concrete, getting lighter and more porous toward the top to reduce weight. The engineers varied the aggregate mixture by height, using heavier basalt at the base and lighter pumice near the crown. It's a technique that shows sophisticated understanding of material properties and structural engineering. But here's what haunts me. We forgot this knowledge completely. For over 1,000 years after Rome fell, no one in Europe could make concrete. The recipe was lost. When we finally reinvented it in the 18th century, we created something inferior. Our concrete is stronger initially but fails faster. We optimized for construction speed and early strength, not for the long-term durability that Roman builders considered essential. Modern researchers are now trying to recreate Roman concrete for use in marine environments. Early tests are promising, but it took us 2,000 years to realize that the ancients had already solved a problem we're still struggling with. The irony is almost painful. We've built a civilization on concrete that crumbles while surrounded by Roman structures that refuse to fall. And if the Romans understood materials science this deeply, imagine what they could do with the basic elements of survival. Because while their concrete defied the sea, they were also building something else that defied nature itself. Something that turned the desert into a paradise without using a single watt of power. The windcatcher towers of Yazd rise like stone sentries against the desert sky. I stood beneath one in summer when the air outside burned at 40 degrees Celsius. Inside, cool, almost cold. No fans, no refrigeration, just ancient Persian architecture channeling wind down through water channels and into living spaces below. These towers are engineering poetry, and they've been doing what our air conditioners do for over 2,000 years without consuming a single watt of power. The principle seems simple until you understand the details. Hot air rises. Cool air sinks, wind blows. But turning those basic facts into a livable climate control system requires understanding fluid dynamics, thermodynamics, and architectural design at a level that most modern engineers would struggle to match without computer modeling. The windcatchers, called badgirs in Persian, capture even the slightest breeze and funnel it downward into the building. As the air descends, it passes over underground water channels or qanat systems, cooling through evaporation before entering the living spaces. What makes this brilliant is the symmetry. The towers have openings on multiple sides, allowing them to catch wind from any direction. But they also create pressure differentials that pull hot air up and out through opposite vents. It's a continuous circulation system powered entirely by temperature gradients and wind pressure. The building breathes, no moving parts, no maintenance beyond occasional cleaning, just physics and geometry working in perfect harmony. I visited a traditional Persian house in Kashan where the cooling system was still functional after 300 years. The owner led me down into the basement level where the temperature dropped so dramatically I reached for a jacket I didn't have. The walls were thick mud brick, providing thermal mass that absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. The windcatcher above channeled air over a small fountain in the courtyard, adding humidity control to the temperature regulation. Every element worked together as an integrated climate system. Modern architecture has mostly abandoned these principles. We sealed our buildings, installed mechanical systems, and consumed massive amounts of energy to achieve what the Persians accomplished with stone, water, and wind. Air conditioning accounts for nearly 20% of global electricity use. In hot climates, it's the single largest energy expense for most buildings. Yet ancient structures in the same regions maintained comfortable temperatures using only passive systems that cost nothing to operate. Recent studies have measured the performance of functioning windcatchers. In some cases, they reduce internal temperatures by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius compared to outside air. The best modern passive cooling systems, designed with computer simulations and advanced materials, struggle to match that performance. And unlike our air conditioners, wind catchers actually improve air quality by creating constant ventilation. No stale air, no sealed environments breeding mold and bacteria. The knowledge isn't completely lost. Architects in the Middle East and North Africa are rediscovering these techniques, incorporating wind catchers and passive cooling into new buildings. But it's a rediscovery, not a continuation. We broke the chain of accumulated wisdom that refined these systems over millennia. Now we're rebuilding it from scratch, learning again what our ancestors knew instinctively. What strikes me most is the humility required to learn from wind and water instead of trying to overpower them with machines. Ancient builders observed nature patiently, then worked with it rather than against it. And that same patient observation led them to master something even more impressive. Because while they were cooling buildings without electricity, they were also crossing oceans without instruments, navigating by signs most of us can't even see. The Polynesian wayfinder held his hand against the horizon and told me we were 17 degrees off course. No instruments, no compass. Just the stars, the waves, and a kind of spatial memory I couldn't comprehend. These navigators crossed the Pacific Ocean in outrigger canoes, finding islands smaller than Manhattan in millions of square miles of open water. They read swells like text. They memorized star paths spanning thousands of miles. Modern sailors with GPS still get lost. They never did. I spent 3 days on a traditional voyaging canoe off the coast of Hawaii, watching a master navigator work. He never looked at charts, never checked instruments. Instead, he lay on his back, feeling the rhythm of swells passing beneath the hull. He explained that ocean waves create patterns, interference zones where different swells meet and interact. These patterns are invisible to the eye but readable through the motion of the boat. Each island creates a unique signature in the surrounding ocean, distortions in wave patterns that can be detected from over 30 miles away. At night, he navigated by stars, but not the way I understood navigation. He'd memorized a star compass, a mental map of where specific stars rise and set throughout the year. He knew over 200 stars by name and position. More importantly, he knew the spaces between them, the angular relationships that told him exactly where he was on the ocean's vast emptiness. When clouds obscured the stars, he switched to reading the wind, the birds, even the color of the water. The cognitive load required for this kind of navigation is staggering. Polynesian wayfinders held mental maps of thousands of miles of ocean, including currents, seasonal wind patterns, migration routes of seabirds, and the locations of islands they might never visit personally. They learned through apprenticeship, spending years memorizing chants that encoded navigational knowledge in poetry and rhythm. The information was never written down. It lived entirely in trained minds, passed from generation to generation through oral tradition. What makes this even more remarkable is the scale of their achievement. Polynesians settled nearly every habitable island in the Pacific, from Hawaii to New Zealand to Easter Island. That's a triangle covering over 16 million square miles of ocean. They did this between 3,000 and 800 years ago, sailing double-hulled canoes loaded with people, plants, and animals. Each journey was a calculated risk based on deep environmental knowledge. They understood trade winds, seasonal weather patterns, and ocean currents with precision that European explorers wouldn't match until centuries later with mechanical instruments. Modern cognitive science has studied traditional navigators, trying to understand how they process spatial information. The research suggests they use different neural pathways than people who rely on maps and GPS. Their brains developed enhanced spatial memory, pattern recognition abilities, and what researchers call allocentric navigation, the ability to maintain orientation relative to external landmarks and environmental cues rather than egocentric references like left and right. It's a fundamentally different way of knowing where you are. We've lost this. Most people today can't navigate their own cities without GPS. We've outsourced spatial awareness to devices, and in doing so, we've allowed those cognitive abilities to atrophy. Studies show that regular GPS use actually changes brain structure, reducing the size of the hippocampus, the region responsible for spatial memory. But navigation wasn't the only domain where ancient people developed cognitive abilities we've abandoned, because while Polynesian wayfinders were crossing oceans by reading waves, other cultures were performing medical procedures that seem impossible even with modern technology. And the survival rates? They'd shock you. The trepanned skull sat in a museum case in Peru, and I couldn't look away. A neat square hole, edges smooth, bone regrowth around the perimeter. This person survived. Not only survived, they healed. Ancient surgeons were drilling into living skulls with stone tools and copper blades, removing bone to relieve pressure, treating head injuries that would kill most people today. Archaeological evidence shows survival rates above 70%. Many modern patients don't fare as well. Trepanation is one of the oldest surgical procedures in human history. Evidence of it appears on every continent except Antarctica, dating back at least 10,000 years. But the Inca and pre-Inca cultures of Peru perfected it to a degree that staggers modern neurosurgeons. Researchers examining hundreds of trepanned skulls found that survival rates improved dramatically over time, reaching their peak around 1400 to 1500 CE. The surgeons were learning, refining their techniques, developing protocols that minimized infection and traumas protocols. The procedure itself seems barbaric until you understand the precision involved. Using obsidian blades sharper than modern surgical steel, ancient surgeons cut through the scalp and carefully removed sections of skull bone. They understood anatomy well enough to avoid critical blood vessels. They knew which areas of the skull could be safely breached and which would cause immediate death. Some skulls show evidence of multiple surgeries, performed years apart, meaning patients not only survived the initial procedure, but returned for additional operations. What protected them from infection? Recent analysis suggests several factors. First, the surgical sites were often treated with plant-based antimicrobials. Compounds from certain Andean plants have proven antibacterial properties that modern pharmacology has confirmed. Second, the high-altitude environment of the Andes is naturally low in pathogenic bacteria. Third, and most remarkably, the surgeons appeared to understand the importance of keeping the brain membrane, the dura mater, intact. Skulls that show careful preservation of this protective layer have much higher survival rates than those where it was breached. I once spoke with a neurosurgeon who studied ancient trepanation techniques. She admitted that the skill level demonstrated in some specimens exceeded what she saw in modern emergency rooms. The bone removal was clean. The edges were beveled to promote healing. The surgery was performed with a level of care that suggests these weren't desperate last resort procedures, but established medical practice with understood protocols and expected outcomes. But trepanation wasn't the only advanced surgery ancient cultures performed. Evidence exists of successful amputations, cataract removals, dental surgeries, and even abdominal procedures. A Roman-era skeleton found in England showed signs of a leg amputation that healed completely, with the bone reshaped and smoothed. The patient lived for years afterward. Ancient Indian texts described cataract surgery using a technique called couching, displacing the clouded lens to restore vision. The question that haunts me isn't just how they performed these surgeries without anesthesia, antiseptics, or antibiotics. It's how they knew they would work. Someone had to be the first patient. Someone had to trust that drilling a hole in their skull would help rather than kill them. And somehow, ancient surgeons built enough success and knowledge to make these procedures routine. But surgical skill was only part of ancient medicine's sophistication. Because while they were operating on living brains, they were also preserving food in ways that modern science is only beginning to decode. And when you see grain that's still viable after 3,000 years, you start questioning everything you know about spoilage and storage. The grain sealed in Egyptian tombs was still edible after 3,000 years. I watched a researcher open a clay jar with hands that trembled slightly. Inside, wheat kernels that could still germinate. The ancient preservation techniques, fermentation, salt curing, honey sealing, controlled drying, created food storage systems so effective that we're only now beginning to understand their microbiology. Our refrigerated supply chains fail after weeks. Theirs lasted millennia. The difference isn't just duration, it's understanding. Ancient cultures developed preservation methods that worked with natural processes rather than fighting them. They understood that certain bacteria could be allies, not enemies. Fermentation wasn't just a preservation technique. It was a way to transform food into something more nutritious, more digestible, and more stable than the raw ingredients. Yogurt, cheese, sauerkraut, kimchi, miso, sourdough. Every culture developed fermented foods that could last months or years without refrigeration. I visited a monastery in France where monks still make cheese using methods unchanged for 800 years. The cheese master explained that they don't add bacteria cultures. They don't need to. The bacteria already live in the caves where the cheese ages, in the wooden shelves, even in the air itself. The monks simply create conditions where beneficial microbes thrive and harmful ones can't compete. It's ecological wisdom applied to food preservation. And it produces cheese that develops complexity over years of aging, something our plastic-wrapped, refrigerated products can never achieve. Salt curing demonstrates another principle the ancients understood instinctively. Salt doesn't kill bacteria through toxicity, it kills through osmosis, drawing water out of microbial cells until they collapse. But different foods require different salt concentrations and different application methods. Ancient fish curers in Scandinavia knew exactly how much salt to use, how long to cure, and how to store the product for maximum shelf life. They created stockfish and bacalao that could feed sailors on year-long voyages without spoiling. Honey preservation might be the most remarkable. Archaeologists have found honey in Egyptian tombs that's still edible after thousands of years. Honey doesn't spoil, ever. It's naturally antimicrobial, too acidic and too low in water content for bacteria to survive. Ancient cultures used honey not just as food but as a preservative for other foods, sealing fruits and even meat in jars of honey. That could last indefinitely. Modern food science has confirmed what they knew empirically. Drying food seems simple, but the ancients refined it to an art. They understood that different temperatures, different humidity levels, and different airflows produced different results. Inca freeze drying of potatoes in the high Andes created chuno, a preserved potato that could last for years and reconstitute into edible food with just water. The process used natural temperature fluctuations, freezing potatoes at night and allowing them to thaw and dry during the day. It's a technique that predates modern freeze-drying technology by at least 1,000 years. What unites all these methods is patience and observation. Ancient food preservers weren't working from theory. They were working from generations of accumulated knowledge, trial and error refined into reliable practice. They developed microbial literacy without microscopes, understanding through observation and taste which processes produced safe food and which led to spoilage or poisoning. We've replaced all of this with refrigeration and chemical preservatives. Faster, more convenient, but also more fragile. When the power fails, our food spoils in days. When supply chains break, we go hungry. Ancient preservation techniques were resilient because they worked with natural processes that couldn't be interrupted. And resilience was something ancient metallurgists understood better than anyone. Because while cultures worldwide were preserving food for decades, smiths in Damascus were forging steel that modern science still can't replicate. The blades they created shouldn't exist, but they do. The Damascus steel blade gleamed under museum lights, patterns swirling across its surface like frozen water. I asked the curator if anyone could recreate it. She paused, then shook her head. Not exactly, not the way the old smiths did. Ancient metallurgists created steels and alloys that pushed matter to its limits, using tools as simple as charcoal furnaces and hammers. Somewhere along the timeline, that knowledge slipped through our fingers. Damascus steel is the most famous example. The real Damascus, the kind used in legendary Middle Eastern swords from about the 8th to the 17th century, came from a special kind of high-carbon steel called woots, produced in India and Sri Lanka. Woots ingots contained a delicate balance of iron, carbon, and trace elements like vanadium. When forged at very specific temperatures and cooled with exquisite control, these ingredients formed microscopic structures that gave the blades their strange combination of sharpness, flexibility, and resilience. Modern metallurgists examining surviving blades under powerful microscopes found carbon nanotube-like structures and bands of carbide crystals threading through the steel. The patterns visible on the surface are not just decoration, they are the signature of this internal microstructure. These swords could take and hold an incredibly fine edge. Stories of Damascus blades cutting other swords in half are likely exaggerated, but their performance on the battlefield was real enough that they became legend. The mystery is not that we cannot make good steel today, we can. Modern tool steels and high-performance alloys surpass ancient steels in many technical metrics. The mystery is that we cannot reproduce the exact historical process that produced Damascus steel with its characteristic microstructure. Somewhere around the 18th century, the knowledge chain broke. The specific ore sources were depleted or abandoned. The precise forging sequences, the subtle cues of color, sound, and feel that smiths used to guide their work were never fully written down. They lived in human hands and eyes, and they died with them. Damascus is not the only case. In Japan, traditional swordsmiths still create tamahagane steel in clay furnaces, smelting iron sand with charcoal over several days. The resulting bloom contains regions with different carbon contents. Masters learn to select and fold these regions to create blades that balance hardness and toughness. Modern metallurgists can analyze the outcome, but replicating the process exactly with all its subtle variations is harder than it looks. Some properties emerge only from imperfect human-controlled conditions. Then there is the puzzle of meteoric iron. Ancient cultures in Egypt, Anatolia, and the Arctic worked iron that fell from the sky before they ever smelted terrestrial ore. Tutankhamun's dagger, tested with modern techniques, was made from meteoric iron with high nickel content. For those early smiths, the material itself must have felt sacred. They learned to cold work and heat treat this alien metal without cracking it. They did not know the word nickel. They did not know about crystalline phases. They just watched, learned, and remembered. What all of this reveals is a different kind of science. Not written formulas and controlled lab experiments, but embodied experiment passed down through apprenticeship. A master smith might change the temperature of a forge based on the sound of the fire or the color of the metal in a darkened room. Those sensory cues are difficult to quantify, but they are real. Lose the masters and you lose the science. There is another material story that mirrors this. It is not metal, it is water. While some cultures bent iron and steel to their will, others bent landscapes, carving invisible rivers beneath deserts and mountains. And the systems they built still quietly run today, long after their makers vanished. The Quanat tunnels beneath Iran stretch for thousands of miles, underground, hand-dug, following aquifer gradients with precision that baffles modern hydrologists. I crawled through one once, water flowing past me in darkness. These tunnels, some over 2,000 years old, still supply entire cities with fresh water. No pumps, no electricity, just gravity, genius, and an understanding of groundwater that we're only beginning to match. The engineering behind Quanats is deceptively simple in concept, but extraordinarily difficult in execution. Diggers started at a water source in the foothills, usually an aquifer fed by mountain snowmelt. Then they tunneled horizontally, following a very slight downward slope toward villages or farmland miles away. The gradient had to be precise. Too steep and the water would erode the tunnel. Too shallow and the flow would stop. They maintained slopes of less than 1 degree over distances that sometimes exceeded 30 miles. How did they keep the tunnel on course? How did they know they were still following the aquifer? They dug vertical shafts every 30 to 50 meters, creating access points for excavation, ventilation, and maintenance. From the surface, these shafts look like a line of craters marching across the landscape. Underground, they allowed workers to remove soil, measure depth, and ensure the tunnel maintained its gradient. The whole system required knowledge of geology, hydrology, and surveying that seems impossible without modern instruments. I met an old Mukani, a Quanat master, in a village outside Yazd. His family had maintained the local Quanat for 11 generations. He explained that the real skill was not just digging, it was reading the earth. Experienced Mukanis could tell the quality of an aquifer by the taste of the water, the dampness of the soil, even the types of plants growing on the surface. They understood seasonal flow patterns, knowing when to open or close certain branches to manage the water supply through drought and flood. The social organization around Quanats was equally sophisticated. Water rights were allocated based on time, with each farmer entitled to a specific number of hours of flow per week. Villages maintained complex schedules tracked by water clocks or appointed timekeepers. The system required cooperation, shared maintenance responsibility, and collective governance that lasted centuries. When the Quanat worked, everyone benefited. When it failed, everyone suffered. This created powerful incentives for preservation and careful management. Quanats are not unique to Iran. Similar systems appear in North Africa, called Fogata, and in parts of China and Afghanistan. The Roman aqueducts are more famous but less sophisticated in some ways. Aqueducts moved water above ground using arches and gravity. Impressive but vulnerable to warfare and weather. Quanats moved water underground, protected from evaporation, contamination, and enemies. In desert climates, this made the difference between survival and abandonment. Modern cities in Iran still depend on ancient quanats. Some have been flowing continuously for over 2 millennia. Compare this to modern water infrastructure. Pipes corrode, pumps break. Treatment plants require constant energy and maintenance. Our systems are powerful but fragile. Ancient systems were less powerful but nearly indestructible. The philosophy was different. We try to dominate nature with force. They tried to work with it through patient observation. But water was not the only force ancient engineers learned to channel. There was something even more elusive, more difficult to capture and predict. While Persian mechanists were mapping invisible rivers underground, Greek astronomers were mapping invisible cycles in the sky. And when you see what they built to track those cycles, you realize we didn't invent computers. We reinvented them. The Antikythera mechanism sat behind glass, and I pressed my face close trying to understand. Gears within gears, bronze wheels tracking the sun, moon, planets, even predicting eclipses, built in ancient Greece over 2,000 years ago. The next device of comparable complexity wouldn't appear for another 14 centuries. When researchers finally decoded it using X-ray tomography, they found computational astronomy that rivaled modern orreries. The mechanism was discovered in 1901 by sponge divers exploring a Roman shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera. For decades it sat in museums, corroded and mysterious. Early researchers knew it was important but couldn't understand its function. The breakthrough came with modern imaging technology that could see through the corrosion and reveal the internal gear trains. What they found was staggering. 30 bronze gears, some with teeth as fine as a millimeter, arranged in a differential gear system that wouldn't be reinvented until the 16th century. The device was an analog computer designed to calculate astronomical positions and predict celestial events. Turn a crank on the side, and dials on the front and back would show the positions of the sun and moon against the zodiac, the phase of the moon, eclipse predictions, and even the timing of the ancient Olympic Games. It incorporated knowledge of the Metonic cycle, the 19-year period after which lunar phases repeat on the same calendar dates. It tracked the irregular orbit of the moon using a pin and slot mechanism that varied the speed of the moon dial. That's differential calculus, implemented in bronze. What strikes me most is the level of precision required. The gear teeth had to be cut accurately or the whole system would bind and fail. The astronomical knowledge had to be correct or the predictions would drift. This wasn't a toy or a curiosity. It was a working scientific instrument built by people who understood both mechanics and mathematics at a level that suggests an entire tradition of such devices. The Antikythera mechanism is the only one that survived, but it couldn't have been the only one that existed. You don't build something this sophisticated on your first try. The Greeks weren't the only ancient culture to build computing devices. The Ishango bone from Central Africa, dated to around 20,000 years ago, shows tally marks that some researchers interpret as a lunar calendar or even prime number calculations. Stonehenge and other megalithic structures functioned as astronomical computers, using alignments to track solstices, equinoxes, and lunar cycles. The Antikythera mechanism is remarkable not because it's unique, but because it survived with enough detail intact to reveal it's sophisticated. Modern researchers have built reconstructions of the mechanism using ancient techniques. They work. The predictions are accurate. But what's humbling is realizing that we only understand this device because we already know the astronomy it computes. If we didn't know about eclipse cycles and planetary motion, we might never have decoded what the gears were calculating. The ancient builders understood these cycles empirically through centuries of observation before they built the machine to predict them. This raises an uncomfortable question. What else did they build that we haven't found? What other technologies disappeared because they were made from materials that corrode, burn, or decay? The Antikythera mechanism survived only because it sank in a shipwreck and was covered by protective sediment. How many similar devices rusted away on land, leaving no trace? But while Greek engineers were building bronze computers to map the heavens, other architects were building stone theaters to channel sound, and the acoustic precision they achieved still makes modern engineers shake their heads in disbelief. Because sometimes the most advanced technology is the one that seems the simplest. "Standing in the amphitheater at Epidaurus?" I whispered. The friend I'd brought stood at the highest row, 200 feet away and 60 feet higher. She heard every word, perfect clarity, no microphones, no speakers, just stone shaped with such precise understanding of acoustics that sound waves focused naturally to every seat. Modern concert halls struggle to achieve this even with computer modeling. The Greeks did it with intuition and mathematics were still decoding. The theater at Epidaurus was built in the 4th century BCE and seats 14,000 people. Researchers have measured its acoustic properties using modern equipment, and the results are extraordinary. A coin dropped on the stage can be heard clearly in the back row. Actors speaking at normal volume reach every listener without amplification. The theater filters out low-frequency background noise like wind and crowd murmur while amplifying the frequencies of human speech. It's not just good acoustics, it's selective acoustics engineered into stone. For centuries, people assumed the acoustic quality came from wind patterns or the hillside shape. But detailed analysis revealed something more deliberate. The limestone seats themselves act as acoustic filters. The rows are stepped at specific heights and angles that create diffraction gratings for sound waves. Low-frequency sounds get trapped between the rows while higher frequencies reflect and amplify. It's the same principle used in modern acoustic baffles, but implemented in the architecture itself rather than added as an afterthought. Even more remarkable is the discovery that the Greeks apparently understood the speed of sound and how it interacts with geometry. The curve of the seating creates focal points where sound converges. The stage is positioned precisely at the acoustic center. Small variations in the design would destroy the effect. This wasn't luck. It was calculation. But we have no written records explaining their acoustic theory. Either the knowledge was considered too basic to write down, or it was transmitted through apprenticeship in demonstration rather than text. I visited modern concert halls designed by the world's best acoustic engineers. Many of them have dead spots where sound disappears, or hot spots where it becomes uncomfortably loud. They require electronic assistance to fill gaps in the acoustic design. Yet a 2,400-year-old open-air theater, subject to wind and weather, achieves better performance naturally. The lesson is humbling. Sometimes less technology means more capability. The Greeks weren't alone in mastering acoustics. The whispering galleries in European cathedrals demonstrate understanding of curved surfaces and sound reflection. Some Mayan pyramids, when you clap at their base, return an echo that sounds like a bird call. Researchers believe this was intentional, connecting the acoustic experience to the sacred Quetzal bird. Chaco Canyon in New Mexico contains structures with acoustic properties that suggest ritual use, with certain frequencies resonating in specific chambers. What all these examples share is architecture designed for human experience rather than visual impact alone. The builders thought in 4 dimensions, considering not just what people would see, but what they would hear, how sound would move through space, how the building would feel to inhabit. We've mostly lost that holistic approach. Modern architecture separates acoustic engineering from structural design, treating sound as a problem to solve rather than an experience to create. But acoustic precision was just one way ancient cultures demonstrated mastery over their environment. While the Greeks were shaping stone to carry whispers, other healers were shaping plants and minerals to carry medicine. And some of what they knew about pain management might surprise anyone who thinks modern pharmaceuticals invented relief. The opium poppy seeds found in Neolithic sites tell only part of the story. Ancient pain management included willow bark for inflammation, containing the same compound we synthesize as aspirin, opium preparations for severe pain, even evidence of hypnotic techniques and pressure point manipulation. The Ebers Papyrus, dated to 1550 BCE, describes hundreds of remedies, many of which modern pharmacology has validated. They understood chemistry without laboratories. What's remarkable is not just that ancient healers used plants for pain relief, it's that they understood dosage, preparation methods, and which conditions responded to which treatments. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, but raw willow bark is harsh on the stomach. Ancient physicians learned to prepare it as tea or poultice, methods that reduce side effects while maintaining effectiveness. They didn't know the molecular structure, they didn't need to. Centuries of observation taught them what worked. Opium is more complex. The opium poppy contains dozens of alkaloids, including morphine, codeine, and thebaine. Different preparation methods extract different compounds in different ratios. Ancient Sumerian texts from 30 till 100 BCE refer to the poppy as the joy plant. Egyptian, Greek, and Roman physicians used opium extensively, developing sophisticated understanding of its effects. They knew it relieved pain and induced sleep. They knew it was dangerous in high doses. But plant-based medicines weren't the only pain management tools. Evidence suggests ancient cultures used physical techniques we're only now rediscovering. Acupuncture, developed in China over 2,000 years ago, involves inserting needles at specific points to relieve pain and treat various conditions. Western medicine dismissed it as superstition until modern research found that acupuncture points often correspond to nerve clusters and that the treatment triggers release of endorphins and other natural pain-relieving compounds. The ancient practitioners didn't know about endorphins. They mapped the points through trial, observation, and accumulated experience. I once spoke with a researcher studying ancient dental practices. She showed me evidence of coca leaf use in South American dentistry, applied directly to gums before procedures. Cocaine, the active compound in coca, is a powerful local anesthetic. Modern dentistry used cocaine derivatives for decades before developing synthetic alternatives. the ancient application was crude by modern standards, but effective. Patients could undergo dental work with reduced pain, making complex procedures possible. Egyptian physicians used a mixture they called the drink for deadening pain, which included opium, hemlock, and other plants. The exact formula is lost, but descriptions suggest it was a general anesthetic used for surgery. Chinese physicians developed similar mixtures. Indian Ayurvedic texts describe surgical procedures performed under the influence of datura and cannabis preparations. These weren't perfect anesthetics, but they were sufficient for practitioners to perform amputations, tumor removals, and other invasive procedures. What strikes me most is the empirical approach. Ancient healers experimented. They tested plants, observed effects, refined dosages, and passed the knowledge forward. Some treatments killed patients. Those were abandoned or modified. Some treatments worked. Those became standard practice. It was science without the scientific method, medicine without medical journals. But it was effective enough that some ancient remedies remain in use today, barely changed. The same empirical approach guided ancient dentistry. And when you see gold bridges and filled cavities and skulls thousands of years old, you start to realize that tooth decay isn't a modern problem. Neither is the drive to fix it. What they accomplished with gold wire and beeswax might make you reconsider your next dental appointment. The Etruscan dental bridge sat in a museum case, and I felt my own teeth ache in sympathy. Gold wire, carved bone, real teeth anchored to false ones with mechanical precision. This wasn't crude dentistry. This was orthodontic engineering from 700 BCE. Recent analysis found filing, drilling, and even evidence of filling cavities with beeswax and plant fibers. Some ancient patients had better dental care than medieval Europeans would receive 2,000 years later. The Etruscans, who lived in what is now Italy before the Romans conquered them, developed dental techniques that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the 18th century. They created bridges using gold bands to hold replacement teeth, either carved from animal bone or taken from human donors. The gold was soft enough to work but strong enough to withstand chewing forces. The bridges were custom fitted to each patient's mouth, shaped to match the contours of remaining teeth and gums. Some examples show wear patterns proving they were functional for years. But the Etruscans weren't alone. Evidence of dental work appears across ancient cultures. Pakistani sites from 7000 BCE show teeth drilled with flint tools, cavities bored out and sometimes filled. The precision suggests specialized practitioners. Drilling into a living tooth without anesthesia or modern tools requires steady hands and patient cooperation. It also requires knowledge of tooth anatomy. Drill too deep and you hit the nerve. Drill at the wrong angle and you crack the tooth. Ancient dentists understood these limits through experience. Egyptian mummies show evidence of dental abscesses treated by drainage, cavities filled with resin, and loose teeth stabilized with gold wire. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dated to 1600 BCE, includes treatments for jaw dislocations and broken jaws. Egyptian physicians understood that dental problems could cause systemic illness. They connected oral health to overall health millennia before modern medicine made the same connection. The Mayans took dental modification to an art form. They drilled teeth and inserted jade, turquoise, and iron pyrite into the holes, creating decorative inlays that required remarkable skill. The inlays weren't just pushed into place. They were secured with plant-based cements that analysis has shown contained compounds similar to modern dental adhesives. Some individuals had multiple inlays across several teeth, suggesting the procedures were survivable and that people returned for additional work. Chinese dentistry developed in a different direction. Texts from 2,000 years ago describe using arsenic paste to kill tooth nerves before extraction, amalgam fillings made from mercury and other metals, and even early forms of dentures. The techniques were refined through dynasties, accumulating knowledge that made Chinese dentistry among the most advanced in the ancient world. European travelers in the medieval period reported being astonished by the quality of dental care in China. What all these examples demonstrate is that dental problems are universal and ancient. Tooth decay appears in skeletal remains as soon as humans developed agriculture and started eating more carbohydrates. The pain of toothache drove innovation. People sought relief, and practitioners developed solutions. Some treatments were dangerous. Mercury amalgam fillings, still controversial today, likely poisoned some patients. But the alternative was often worse. Untreated dental infections can spread to the jaw, the brain, even cause sepsis and death. Ancient dentists worked without the benefits we take for granted. No x-rays to see inside teeth. No local anesthetics beyond plant extracts. No antibiotics to prevent infection. Yet they performed procedures that preserved teeth and improved lives. The skill required was extraordinary. But preservation wasn't limited to teeth. While ancient dentists were saving individual smiles, ancient dyers were creating colors that would outlast empires. And when you see fabric 1,500 years old still blazing with purple, you start to question everything about permanence. The Roman purple on the textile fragment hadn't faded. 1,500 years, and the color still blazed like it was dyed yesterday. Tyrian purple, extracted from thousands of sea snails, creating a pigment so chemically stable that nothing natural could break it down. Modern synthetic dyes fade in sunlight within years. Ancient organic dyes outlast empires. We still don't fully understand the molecular structure that gives them such permanence. Tyrian purple came from murex snails found in the Mediterranean. Each snail produced only a few drops of the precursor fluid, which oxidized in air to create the distinctive purple color. It took roughly 12,000 snails to produce enough dye for a single garment. The expense made it a symbol of royalty and power. Roman emperors reserved certain shades for their exclusive use. But the chemistry is what fascinates me. The dye bonds to fabric at a molecular level, becoming part of the fiber structure rather than just coating the surface. Modern analysis of ancient purple-dyed fabrics shows the color molecules embedded deep within wool and silk fibers. The dye doesn't sit on top where UV light and oxygen can easily break it down. It penetrates and locks in place through chemical bonds that remain stable for millennia. Synthetic dyes, designed for fast production and bright initial color, typically work through weaker bonds that photodegrade quickly. We optimized for the wrong properties. Tyrian purple is dramatic but not unique. Indigo, derived from plants in the genus Indigofera, creates blues that rival synthetic dyes in permanence. Ancient Egyptian, Indian, and South American cultures independently developed indigo dyeing. The process requires fermentation to convert the plant material into a soluble form, then oxidation to fix the color. It's chemistry without understanding chemistry, but the results speak for themselves. Indigo-dyed textiles, thousands of years old, still retain deep blue color. Red dyes present an even more diverse picture. Madder root, Kermes insects, cochineal insects, and various plants provided reds and oranges with different properties. Ancient dyers understood that different mordants, metal salts used to fix dyes to fabric, produced different shades and different permanence. Aluminum mordants gave bright colors. Iron mordants gave darker, more durable colors. Tin mordants gave intense but less stable shades. This is coordination chemistry discovered through experimentation centuries before modern science. I once examined a Paracas textile from Peru, dated to around 200 BCE. Over 200 colors, multiple dye sources, complex mordanting. The color preservation after more than 2,000 years was shocking. The textile had been buried, protecting it from light but not from chemical degradation. Yet the colors remained vibrant. Modern synthetic fabrics left in similar conditions would have disintegrated or faded to gray within decades. What enabled this permanence? Part of it is the dye chemistry. Natural dyes often contain multiple related compounds rather than a single pure molecule. This chemical complexity provides redundancy. If one compound degrades, others remain. Synthetic dyes are typically single molecules, optimized for specific properties, but vulnerable to single-point failure. Natural dyes are messier, but more resilient. Another factor is the mordanting process. Ancient dyers discovered that pre-treating fabric with metal salts created binding sites for dye molecules. The metal ions form bridges between dye and fiber, creating stable complexes. Modern textile chemistry has confirmed this mechanism, but ancient dyers discovered it empirically, testing different treatments until they found what worked. But color wasn't the only property ancient material scientists mastered. While dyers were creating permanence in thread, builders were creating flexibility in stone. And when you stand beside walls that have danced through hundreds of earthquakes without falling, you realize that rigid strength isn't always the answer. Machu Picchu shouldn't still be standing. Built on a mountain ridge in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth, yet 500 years later, it remains largely intact. The Inca used a technique called ashlar masonry, stones cut so precisely they locked together without mortar, flexing during earthquakes rather than crumbling. Modern buildings in the same region collapse regularly. The ancient ones dance with the earth and survive. The principle seems counterintuitive. We think of strength as rigidity, but the Inca understood that flexibility often outlasts brute force. Their walls are built from stones cut into complex interlocking shapes, some with dozens of facets fitting against neighbors. When the ground shakes, the stones shift slightly, absorbing energy through friction and micro movements. Then they settle back into place. The wall moves as a unified flexible mass rather than as a rigid structure that can crack. I once pressed my hand against an Inca wall in Cusco, trying to feel the joints between stones. Impossible. The fit is so tight that researchers have tested with feeler gauges and found tolerances less than a millimeter. Some joints are so perfect that not even a sheet of paper slides between stones. Yet these walls have survived hundreds of earthquakes that destroyed Spanish colonial buildings constructed on top of Inca foundations. The colonial builders used mortar, thinking it would add strength. Instead, it created rigid structures that shattered when the earth moved. The cutting process itself remains partially mysterious. The Inca worked with granite and andesite, extremely hard stones. They had bronze tools, but bronze is softer than the stone being cut. Researchers believe they used a combination of techniques, pecking with harder stone hammers to rough out shapes, grinding with sand and water to achieve final fit, possibly heating and rapid cooling to create fracture lines. But the precision suggests something more, some technique or tool we haven't identified. What's certain is that the work required extraordinary patience. Some stones at Sacsayhuaman, the fortress above Cusco, weigh over 100 tons and have surfaces with compound curves. Fitting these precisely would challenge modern stoneworkers with power tools and measuring instruments. The Inca did it with patience, skill, and a tolerance for iteration that modern construction schedules don't allow. But earthquake resistance wasn't unique to South America. Japanese pagodas, some over 1,000 years old, have survived countless earthquakes through a different principle. They use a central pillar that hangs independently from the main structure, acting like a pendulum that counteracts building movement. When the pagoda sways during an earthquake, the pillar swings in opposition, damping the oscillations. It's a principle similar to modern tuned mass dampers, discovered centuries earlier through observation and experimentation. Traditional Japanese wooden architecture also uses flexible joinery, complex interlocking joints held together by friction and wooden pegs rather than nails or glue. The joints allow controlled movement during stress, dissipating energy that would otherwise cause structural failure. Modern seismic engineers are studying these traditional techniques, finding that ancient builders understood principles of resonance, damping, and flexible response that contemporary design is only beginning to appreciate. The lesson isn't that ancient buildings are stronger than modern ones. It's that ancient builders solved problems differently. They couldn't calculate stress loads or model seismic forces, so they observed what survived and what fell, accumulating knowledge through generations of earthquake experience. They built in harmony with forces they couldn't measure but could feel. And feeling, observing, remembering without writing, that takes us to perhaps the most remarkable cognitive achievement of ancient cultures. Because while some societies were building structures that could survive earthquakes, others were building memory systems that could survive empires. No alphabet, no paper, just colored string, knots, and minds trained to read information invisible to the rest of us. The quipu hung in my hands like a riddle made of string. Knots in wool and cotton, encoding information the Inca used to run an empire. No alphabet, no written language, just a three-dimensional recording system that stored census data, astronomical calculations, historical records, and administrative information across thousands of miles. Recent research suggests the knots encode a base 10 numerical system and possibly even narrative information. We barely understand 10% of it. Each quipu consists of a primary cord with pendant strings hanging from it. The pendant strings contain clusters of knots at different positions. The number of knots, their placement, the type of knot, the color of the string, the direction of spin, even the spacing between clusters. All of it carries meaning. A trained quipu kamiyok, a keeper of the knots, could read these devices like we read spreadsheets. They recorded tribute payments, population counts, storehouse inventories, military units, and possibly laws and histories. The numerical system is partially decoded. Different knot types represent different magnitudes. A figure 8 knot in a certain position means 1. Multiple overhand knots in another position represent tens. The absence of knots in a position can represent 0, a mathematical concept that many ancient cultures, including the Greeks and Romans, lacked. The Inca independently developed place value notation and 0 without writing a single numeral. But numbers are just the beginning. Spanish chroniclers recorded that Quipucameoyacs could recite histories and genealogies by reading their quipus. Modern researchers have found quipus with structures too complex for pure numerical data. Some contain hundreds of pendant strings in elaborate hierarchical arrangements. Color patterns repeat in ways that suggest grammatical structure. The spacing and grouping resemble the organization of narrative rather than accounting. If quipus encode language, we've lost the key. The Spanish conquistadors burned most quipus as pagan objects. The Quipucameoyacs died or were forbidden to practice their craft. The knowledge transmission broke. What survives are fragments, roughly 600 quipus in museum collections worldwide. Researchers compare them, looking for patterns, trying to crack a code that might not be crackable without a living tradition to guide them. What strikes me most is the cognitive load this system required. A Quipucameoc had to memorize not just how to read knots but also context. The same knot pattern might mean different things depending on what type of information the Quipucameo recorded. Color associations had to be learned. Regional variations existed. It was a system that lived in trained human minds backed up by the physical quipus but not fully contained in them. Lose the people and you lose the language. This pattern repeats across ancient cultures. Australian Aboriginal peoples maintained oral histories spanning tens of thousands of years through song lines, mnemonic paths across the landscape where geographical features triggered memorized narratives. African griots preserved genealogies and histories through performance and rhythm. Polynesian navigators memorized vast bodies of knowledge encoded in chants. These weren't primitive substitutes for writing. They were sophisticated information systems optimized. We've lost most of these systems, not because they were inferior, but because they required continuous human practice. When colonization disrupted communities, when languages died, when elders passed away before fully training successors, the knowledge vanished. Written records can survive abandonment. Oral traditions cannot. The trade-off we made when we chose writing was preservation at the cost of embodied knowledge. And that trade-off defines our relationship with ancient wisdom. We've gained the ability to store vast information externally. We've lost the cognitive skills to hold it internally. We've gained precision and reproducibility. We've lost intuition and embodied understanding. The question isn't whether we've progressed. It's what we've left behind in the process, and whether some of what we've lost might be worth reclaiming. The dust still clings to my boots. Not from one site, but from 15 different journeys into what we've forgotten. Each discovery, each ancient technique, each impossible achievement, they add up to something uncomfortable. A pattern, a realization that progress isn't a straight line climbing upward. It's more like a river that shifts course, abandoning old channels as it carves new ones. And sometimes, what gets left behind in those abandoned channels is worth more than we realized. I think about the Egyptian builders who placed stones with millimeter precision without blueprints, the Roman engineers whose concrete still stands while ours crumbles, the Persian architects who cooled buildings without electricity, the Polynesian navigators who crossed oceans without instruments, the Inca surgeons whose patients survived at rates that rival modern medicine. Each one mastered their domain through patient observation, accumulated knowledge, and cognitive skills we've traded away for different abilities. We haven't become less intelligent. We've become differently intelligent. We've outsourced spatial reasoning to GPS. We've outsourced memory to databases. We've outsourced craft knowledge to instruction manuals and YouTube tutorials. Each trade brings benefits. I'm not arguing for a return to ancient methods. I'm suggesting we've lost something valuable in the exchange and we barely noticed it leaving. What the ancients had was time. Time to observe, time to experiment, time to refine techniques across generations. They didn't need to optimize for quarterly profits or rushing products to market. A master craftsperson spent decades perfecting skills. An apprentice learned through years of hands-on practice. Knowledge accumulated slowly but deeply, embedding itself in human hands and minds rather than in external records. Modern civilization privileges explicit knowledge, information that can be written down, measured, reproduced. Ancient cultures excelled at tacit knowledge, wisdom that exists in bodies and intuitions, passed through demonstration rather than description. Both types matter, but we've systematically devalued tacit knowledge, and in doing so we've lost access to solutions that no amount of theory can fully recreate. The irony is that many of our current challenges, sustainable architecture, resilient infrastructure, less energy-intensive living, were already solved by cultures we consider primitive. They weren't primitive, they were patient. They worked with nature's constraints rather than trying to overpower them with technology. Sometimes the old way isn't the backward way. Sometimes it's just a different path to the same destination. Another piece of the puzzle, another secret swallowed by the ages. But I've learned one thing on this path. History doesn't whisper, it waits. And if we're willing to listen, to look beyond our assumptions about progress, we might find that the future we're building was already sketched in the past. We just need the humility to recognize it.